day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in. Good day and welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by American Jewish Committee. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's digital platform that enables you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. Earlier this week, ahead of the third anniversary of the Pittsburgh synagogue attack, AJC released its 2021 State of Anti-Semitism in America report based on new national polling of the US, Jewish, and general adult populations. The surveys, the largest and most comprehensive of their kind ever conducted, confirm that hatred of Jews remains a severe problem in the United States, requiring urgent attention, and that American Jews and the US general public view the problem very differently. Joining us today for an in-depth analysis of the report's findings and what they mean for efforts to combat anti-Semitism in America are Avi Meir, AJC Managing Director, Public Affairs and Senior Spokesperson, and Holly Huffnagel, AJC US Director for Combating Anti-Semitism. Avi and Holly will present the data and will then be joined by Melanie Marin-Pell, AJC Chief Field Operations Officer, for a deeper dive into the survey data. After we hear from our esteemed guests, we will take your questions. You may email your question to questions@ajc.org, that's questions plural, or use the Q&A feature in Zoom. Avi, Holly, turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Daniel, and thank you all for joining us here today. Let's jump right into the presentation. Holly, next slide. As Daniel mentioned, these are the largest ever surveys of both the Jewish American public and the general public on the subject of anti-Semitism in America. This is, of course, not the first time that we've conducted surveys of this kind. We'll talk a little bit about that later on, but these are the largest in terms of sample and the most comprehensive in terms of the methodology. So we combined both phone and online survey techniques to ensure that we had the most accurate sample that we possibly could have. And we conducted these surveys over the course of September and October in order to ensure that the data was as fresh as it could possibly be ahead of its release this past week in the form of AJC's 2021 State of Anti-Semitism in America report. Next slide. Perhaps the most jarring finding, and the one that has gotten the most media attention over the past few days, is that 1 in 4 American Jews reported having been the target of anti-Semitism over the past year. Now, that, of course, does not mean that we have 1 out of every 4 Jews who has been physically attacked. Thankfully, that number was comparatively low. But we saw that quite a few American Jews reported having been the victims of in-person verbal attacks, attacks online, on social media. This is something that is very prevalent in the lives of many American Jews. Additionally, we also asked American Jews whether their Jewish institutions which they are affiliated had been targeted by anti-Semitism over the past 5 years. And again, 1 in 4 said the answer was yes, that their Jewish institutions, synagogues, JCCs, Jewish schools had been attacked in some form, either graffiti, threats, or physically over the past 5 years. Quite jarring statistics. Next slide. As a result, 4 in 10 American Jews said that they've changed their behavior over the past 12 months out of fear of anti-Semitism. Now, this is not the first time that we've asked this question. We asked this question last year and the year before, but at the time, the timelines that we presented were much broader. We asked if they changed their behavior ever over the past 5 years. This time we specified, have you engaged in changed behavior over the past 12 months? And 4 out of 10, 40% of respondents said yes. What does that look like? 17% said that they've avoided certain places, events, or situations out of fear of anti-Semitism. 22%, that's more than 1 out of every 5, said that they've avoided making themselves visually identifiable as a Jew for fear of anti-Semitism. That means displaying certain items, wearing certain items, carrying certain items for fear of being identified as Jewish. And 25%, 1 out of every 4, said that they've held themselves back from posting content online that would identify them as Jewish or would betray their views on Jewish issues. 39% of American Jews, 4 out of every 10, have made decisions of this kind out of fear of anti-Semitism. Next slide. Now, we asked specifically about anti-Semitism on college campuses. We know that this is of grave concern to many, particularly those who are themselves college students or who have children or grandchildren who are in college. What we found is that quite a few American Jews had experienced anti-Semitism on a college campus or knew someone who had, but the numbers were quite different amongst those who are on campus themselves, students, and their parents and the rest of the American Jewish public. So while about 42% of college students and their parents reported that either they or someone they knew had experienced anti-Semitism on a college campus over the past year. That number dropped to 15% of the general Jewish public. We talk about different sources of anti-Semitism. You see that presented on the screen right here. We have the far right, the far left, and anti-Israel campaigns, including the BDS movement. It's very clear that American Jews view the far right as representing the greatest anti-Semitic threat to Jewish students on campus, but it is certainly true that they also view the far left and anti-Israel campaigns, including the BDS movement, as posing a threat to Jewish students. That, by the way, was true also of the general public. When we asked the general public, the general Jewish public, where they thought the greatest anti-Semitic threats in America lay, they again said that the far right posed the greatest threat, followed by threats posed by extremism propagated in the name of Islam. Then they said that they believed that there were threats that were also posed by the far left and other sources of anti-Semitism. So anti-Semitism comes from multiple sources. We of course know that, and this data confirms that American Jews are indeed concerned about those multiple sources. Ali, over to you. One more item on my in my little segment here. We asked about whether Jews felt more or less secure this year as opposed to last year. Here we actually have a somewhat encouraging sign that while last year, when we asked this question, only 4% said that they felt more secure then than they did a year before, this year that number rose to 11%. And while last year the number of those who felt less secure was in the 40s, now we see that 30-something% of American Jews said they actually feel that they feel less secure last year, which of course is encouraging. We want people to feel more secure, not less. Of course, the majority in both cases, both last year and this year, said that they feel roughly the same degree of security this year as they did a year prior.
Thank you, Avi. Now, before I look at how the general public responded to our survey questions, I wanted to take a moment to do a little deeper dive into how American Jews have experienced anti-Semitism on social media. So we asked American Jews, if they've been targeted by anti-Semitism online. We found that 1 in 8 American Jews had, that's 12%, in the last 12 months. So as Avi mentioned, we changed some of our timeframes this year. We found that asking American Jews about the last 5 years, it's hard to remember, and it actually wasn't helpful for the tech platforms with which we were engaging. We had heard from Facebook, we had heard from, Twitter, other tech platforms saying our policies have changed in the last 5 years extensively. The data needs to be more recent. So we asked, what's the last 12 months look like for you? And unfortunately, we still see the numbers here. So of the American Jews who were targeted on various social media platforms, we see 55% on Facebook, 35% on Twitter, 11% on YouTube, 10% on Instagram, 5% on Clubhouse. This is our first time asking about Clubhouse, a new audio only social media platform, and then 4% on TikTok. Again, we were asking American Jewish adults over the ages of 18. We do recognize that if we had asked younger American Jews, we think the numbers on TikTok would be a lot higher. But I will point out here that even though this is a very small percentage, last year in 2020, we found that 2% of American Jews had been targeted on TikTok in the last 5 years. And this year it's 4% just in the last 12 months. So this is important to note. And the last thing I'll say here is that 42% of American Jews who had been targeted by anti-Semitism on these platforms reported it, yet only 36% of that reported content was at least removed in part. So we actually see not as many Jews reporting the incidents online, and then we're seeing less of a response on the platforms by the platforms themselves to remove that content. So this was something we did last year. For the first time, we asked Americans what they knew about anti-Semitism. Do they even know what it is? Do they perceive that it's rising? Is it a problem? And this year we had that companion survey as well alongside the American Jewish adults. And the very first question we asked again this year was, are you familiar with the term anti-Semitism? And we found that 65% know the term and what it means. 18% had heard the term, but were unsure what it meant. And then 16% had never heard the term before. So what we have here is we have, 1 in 3, 34% of Americans who still are not familiar with anti-Semitism. I will point out, though, for those of you who know the data from last year, that 34% number was 46% last year who were unfamiliar, almost half of Americans. So we do see a greater level of awareness. And I think this is one of the big good news findings of this survey, that there's more awareness of the term anti-Semitism this year than last year. We also asked a very interesting a question that you might think would be an obvious question to ask. We hadn't asked this before. We wanted to know if Americans even know people who are Jewish. Do they personally know someone who is Jewish? And we found that more than 1 in 3 Americans, almost 4 in 10, don't know anyone who is Jewish. And this was actually a big finding because it affects how they answered the other questions. So for instance, if we go back to this graph again, this pie chart, and we see the 65% number, that number drops to 43% of people who are familiar with the term who don't know Jews. So we can already see that there's a correlation between people who know Jews, people who know what the term anti-Semitism is. So these are some of our comparative findings, and these are really helpful for our advocacy to know where we need to go next. So we asked, how much of a problem do you think anti-Semitism is in the United States? Again, this number is exact same as it was last year. 9 in 10 American Jews, 90% say anti-Semitism is a problem, compared to 60% of the US adult population. I think getting Americans to agree on anything, even 60%, that's actually something that should be lauded. But I think our focus needs to be on the not a problem section. So you can see here under not a problem, 1 in 4 Americans, 25%, do not think anti-Semitism is a problem in our country today. And this is actually the opposite of what the FBI data, the data shows. So one question that we do get is, is this how American Jews are feeling, their perceptions of anti-Semitism, or is it really the facts on the ground? Is it really happening? And we can point to the data from the FBI and say, yes, actually, American Jews do experience anti-Semitism. This is a problem in our country. This data you see here, 57.5%, this is from 2020. This data was released by the FBI a couple of months ago, and American Jews represent 57.5, almost 60% of all religious bias crimes in America, and they only make up 2% of the population. So Jews are 2 in every 100 Americans. They make up 60% of those anti-religious bias crimes. But an interesting finding is that Jews actually make up 1 in 11 of all hate crimes, all reported hate crimes in America. And so we can just see the starkness of these numbers and really show that this is a problem in the United States. One question that we asked this year that we did not ask last year, though, is if Americans had seen anti-Semitism. We know American Jews are experiencing it. We know the general public, may not be aware of the term, but are they seeing attacks against Jews in person, online, or against a Jewish institution? And this was a surprising finding. It was for me, at least, to find that 4 in 10 Americans had seen anti-Semitism in the last 12 months. So not in the last 5 years, just in the last 12 months alone, 41% had seen it, and 31% of Americans had actually seen anti-Semitism more than once. Despite these numbers of seeing anti-Semitism, I think this was one of our biggest divergences, is if it's rising. And we asked this question as well last year, and the results are unfortunately remain very similar, this lack of awareness of the increase of anti-Semitism. So we asked, over the past 5 years, do you think that anti-Semitism in the United States has increased, stayed the same, decreased? 8 in 10 American Jews, 82%, say anti-Semitism has increased in the last 5 years, where that number is almost half. 44% of the general public believe that it has increased. And again, 15% of the general public actually believe anti-Semitism has decreased compared to a very small number of Jews, which is actually within that margin of error of plus or minus 3.9%. We did put on a new segment to this question this year that we did not last year, and that was don't know. If you don't know, you can put that. And it was interesting to see that almost 20%, 1 in 5 Americans, they didn't want to say increase or decrease. They just don't know. They don't have that information. So again, that speaks to where we can go in an educative fashion to raise awareness amongst the general population. I'll say one more thing before turning it over to Avi. I think this divergence in awareness really came to a head when we asked specific questions about what happened last May. Avi, over to you.
Thank you, Holly. There's an interesting data point that I think is worth spending some time discussing. As I mentioned earlier, American Jews overwhelmingly view the far right as posing the greatest anti-Semitic threat, followed by extremism propagated in the name of Islam. But something we noticed this year is that there was a 10-point jump between last year's figure in terms of American Jews who believe the far left poses a threat, and this year, where about 71% said that the far left in America poses at least some anti-Semitic threat to American Jews. And this might help explain why. We asked about awareness of events surrounding the conflict between Israel and Hamas this past May, where we know that Jews were attacked in the streets, not only in America, but around the world. And then we asked both Jews and non-Jews whether they had even heard that those attacks took place. And here we see a very clear divergence between Jews and the general public, whereas 71% of American Jews said that they had heard either a lot or some about Jews being attacked during that conflict. Only 48% of the general public said the same. A majority, 53% of the general public said that they had heard not much or nothing at all about Jews being attacked during the Israel-Hamas conflict, compared to only 28% of American Jews who said they had heard little to nothing about it. Now, what's interesting about this, and perhaps very disturbing, is that of the 71% of American Jews who said that they had heard a lot or some about these attacks, 72% within that number said that it made them feel less safe as Jews in America. And it's also notable that young people were overrepresented. Over 80% of young people said that the anti-Semitic attacks that took place during the Israel-Hamas conflict this past summer made them feel less safe as Jews in America. Next slide, please. Now, this, of course, is very powerful. We asked about the statement, Israel has no right to exist. That, of course, is the underpinning, the very basic statement of anti-Zionism, the belief that the Jewish people do not have a right to self-determination. And we asked whether that is an anti-Semitic statement. And overwhelmingly, both American Jews and the general public said yes. Anti-Zionism, as represented by the statement, Israel has no right to exist, is anti-Semitic. And this was true of overwhelming majorities of both, as I said, Jews and the general public, but also Democrats and Republicans, different age groups, different places in the country, different Jewish denominations. Overwhelmingly, large majorities of all those groups say that that is indeed an anti-Semitic statement. And that, of course, has significant ramifications for conversations that we have around Israel, around anti-Zionist rhetoric on college campuses, on social media, and elsewhere. And with that, that brings us to the end of our presentation. And I'm happy to punt things over to my colleague, Melanie Marinpel. Melanie, over to you.
Avi and Holly, thank you both so much for walking us through these important findings. And I'd like to spend a few minutes with you digging a bit deeper into some of this, and then we can open it up to our audience for their questions. I do want to note a number of our audience members have asked if the slides will be available. We will make these available. They will likely be on our website, so stay tuned on that. But yes, they will be available. Avi, I'd like to start, let's back up a little bit and perhaps zoom back out. Can you give us a little bit more background on how and why AJC undertook this report? Why did we begin asking these questions, and how has the report evolved since our first year?
Absolutely. So we first conducted a survey of American Jews on anti-Semitism in America shortly after the horrific attack at the synagogue in Pittsburgh 3 years ago. We realized that we simply didn't have the cold, hard facts to back up our sense that American Jews were feeling insecure, that they felt that anti-Semitism was on the rise, and we absolutely needed to have that data in order to engage in what we believe is so important, which of course is data-driven advocacy. We believe that we must have the numbers to back up our advocacy positions for the policies that we're trying to promote in Congress and throughout the country. And so we engage in the very first, by the way, the first ever survey of American Jews on the subject of anti-Semitism. That was, again, 2 years ago. Last year, we accompanied that survey with a parallel survey of the general public. Because when we had conversations with our interlocutors in government and other faith and ethnic organizations, and really others throughout the country, we kept hearing after that first survey that it would be so valuable for us to have comparable data about the general public, whether non-Jews in America view the problem with as much gravity as Jews, whether they're even aware of anti-Semitism, what they consider to be anti-Semitic, whether they've seen anti-Semitism, and so on and so forth. So last year, for the very first time, we conducted 2 surveys in parallel, one of American Jews, the second of the general public, and we combined them in what we are now referring to as the State of Anti-Semitism in America report. This is now the second iteration of that report with those 2 parallel surveys. It's important to note that we changed the methodology somewhat this year. We realized that it is extremely important to us to, for example, have young people represented in our surveys. And we know that there are many young people who either don't have phones, don't have landlines, or who may not answer the phone if they get a call from a strange number. And so this year we made sure there was also an online component, so that we were combining both phone and online survey techniques to ensure that we were getting to the broadest swath of the American public, both Jewish and non-Jewish, as we possibly could.
Thank you. And I know there was one question, just one note on methodology. The general public does not include Jews. Is that correct, or might it?
It does include Jews, but a very minute percentage, which of course is the representation of Jews within the general American electorate. So we've actually at times removed Jews from the equation. We find that the numbers don't vary very much at all.
Great, thank you. Holly, I'd like to ask you, why is this report important?
This report's important because I think it's coming at a time of change in our country. 3 years after Pittsburgh, there's been a whole host of changes, an administration change, rising levels of economic uncertainty, trust in government, divisiveness in our country. And it's really important, I think, especially at the time around Pittsburgh, to reassess, where are we? Is anti-Semitism still an issue? Is it still top of mind for the Jewish community? Yes, it is. Is general public more aware of it? In fact, actually, this year we found that they are more aware, at least of the term. They are seeing anti-Semitism, even though 36% of U.S. adults don't know Jews. 60% still recognize anti-Semitism as a current concern. So that can actually be a good thing. So it really helps us know where do we need to go forward in our advocacy. And I think it's really important too that we present the report, for what it is. We have all of the data. We know that these are really large sample sizes for a Jewish organization to undertake, but that we look at the margin of error. We don't extrapolate the small percentages to really big numbers. We're accurate with what we have, and then we can actually go to the various interlocutors and say, this is how American Jews are feeling, and this is what Americans need to know about it.
Thank you. And Holly, you noted in the slides that 1 in 4 American Jews reported being the target of anti-Semitism in the past 12 months. And we also saw the juxtaposition with the FBI data on hate crimes. And yet we know that many, if not the majority of incidents, go unreported. So can you speak a little bit about the gaps in reporting, sort of the mechanics of hate crimes reporting, and why that matters as well?
So we only know what we know, and that sounds so simple, but there are huge holes in the FBI data. It's all voluntary. We know that there are even, I think the number is 70 cities, it's maybe more, of over 100,000 people who actually report 0 hate crimes. And we see the majority of Jews, and we asked them. We said, "Did you report to the police? Did you report to a Jewish organization? Did you report to the tech platform on which you were targeted?" And the majority of Jews actually don't report, even for that small number. And again, when we get into really small numbers, we have to be very, very careful. But for instance, there were 37 American Jews who reported being physically attacked in the last 12 months. That is 2.6% rounded to 3%. So this is, very small. But even for those numbers, half of them didn't even go to the police for a physical attack. Now, again, that could be, taking a kippah off someone's head or pushing them to actual really a violence against them. We don't know, but we know that American Jews aren't reporting. We know that Americans are seeing anti-Semitism. 40% are seeing it, and most likely aren't reporting. But I think the other big gap here is ensuring that law enforcement is taking anti-Semitism seriously. And anti-Semitic hate crimes are prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, because we need to show, they need to show the American Jewish community that please report it. We will do something with your report. And that was another big finding, Melanie, of this report, of this most recent survey, was that we asked American Jews if they approve of how law enforcement is handling anti-Semitism. And 66% of American Jews approve of law enforcement's handling of anti-Semitism, but that number is actually down from 81% approval rating in 2019. So we can just see in the last couple of years this, drop in approval of how law enforcement is handling anti-Semitism. So the reporting, the taking it seriously is a direction we need to continue to move forward on.
Thank you. And for our audience to know, AJC has briefed FBI leadership and other law enforcement groups, as well as many others, on this data. We will continue to do that because we know it's so important for them to see these important findings as well. Avi, I'd like to turn back to you for a moment and return to part of the report that you spent a little bit of time on, but I think it's so important, and I'm sure our audience is interested in this. And that is that both American Jews and the US general public overwhelmingly view anti-Zionism, as represented by the statement, "Israel has no right to exist," as a form of anti-Semitism. And we saw that this included 92% of Republicans and 83% of Democrats. It's really a striking statistic. So help us understand a little bit more about why this matters and how it helps us at AJC advance our advocacy priorities.
That's a great question. And I actually think we saw a very clear illustration of why this is so important just last week when a climate group in DC announced that it was distancing itself from Zionist Jewish organizations, as though there's some major distinction between Zionist and Jewish, or between anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic. And they said, no, that we have nothing against Jews, we're just anti-Zionist. And what we see here is that both Jews and the general public do not make that distinction. They view anti-Zionism as indeed a form of anti-Semitism. And this is important for a variety of reasons. It's important because we see statements being made by certain elected officials. We see statements on social media, we see statements on college campuses going against Zionists, claiming that Zionism is somehow an evil or a form of racism, and that Zionists are themselves evil or racist. And what we see here is that for the majority, the overwhelming majority of both Jews and non-Jews in America, that is a distinction without a difference. And when you refer to Zionists and when you slam Zionism, which of course, again, is the belief in the Jewish right to self-determination in the land of Israel, that is viewed by the overwhelming majority of both Jews and non-Jews in America as anti-Semitic. So this is actually extremely valuable to us, and it gives us the ammunition we need to respond to claims about Zionism, claims about being just anti-Zionist and not anti-Semitic, by saying, we're sorry, but that is not a legitimate distinction, because that is not something that either Jews or non-Jews in America will accept.
Thank you. And similarly, when we talk about the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, or the BDS movement, both American Jews and members of the US general public who are familiar with the movement largely view it as having anti-Semitic elements. That said, most Americans remain largely unaware of the movement compared to a slight majority of American Jews. We saw that 82% of American Jews who were familiar with the movement said it is either anti-Semitic or had anti-Semitic supporters, compared to 66% of the general public. We also know that following the conflict in May, we saw this absolute torrent of BDS resolutions emerging in all kinds of places: city councils, teachers unions, among academics and academic institutions on campuses, and in many other venues and groupings that generally don't comment on international issues, and yet felt compelled to adopt BDS resolutions, as a way to state their feelings about what was happening and condemn Israel. So similar question: how can this kind of data, as we anticipate and know that we will continue to confront BDS efforts, the BDS movement, what should we be doing with this data to help us in that fight?
Well, I think it's important to hone in on something that you said, which I think is quite striking, and we saw it last year as well. The more someone knows about the BDS movement, the more that person is likely to view the BDS movement as infected by anti-Semitism, either as an anti-Semitic movement itself or one that has anti-Semitic supporters. The majority, as you said, of Americans do not know about the BDS movement, have heard little to nothing at all. But the smaller number of those who have indeed heard about it largely view it to be a movement that has at least some anti-Semitic elements. I think it's important for us to make that point whenever we're having conversations with city councils or with student bodies or other places in America that have been confronted by this challenge posed by BDS, which again is a challenge that most Americans aren't even aware of, and of course whose successes have been few and far between. But this is something that I think is extremely important, because when we talk about anti-Semitism, which large numbers of Americans, both Jewish and non-Jewish, acknowledge is a problem in America, it's important to say that BDS is only contributing to the problem, certainly not helping. It's not bringing peace in Israel or between Israel and the Palestinians. It is actually causing American Jews to feel less safe. It is viewed by the overall majority of American Jews who at least know what it is as a form of anti-Semitism, or something that has at least some anti-Semitic elements. And that is something that I think should be on the minds of those who are engaging in these conversations, who are considering BDS resolutions or BDS motions, that when they engage in these conversations, when they single out Israel for treatment that is not applied to any other comparable country in the world, that is viewed by a large majority of Jews who at least have some familiarity with it as at least infected by anti-Semitism. And I think that's extremely important.
Thank you. That's so well stated. So thank you. Holly, the report also really helps us understand perceptions. And one significant dichotomy between American Jews and the general public is that while 82% of American Jews believe anti-Semitism has increased over the past 5 years, only 44% of the general public agrees. So can you help us understand this a little bit better, this dichotomy, especially when we see awareness of anti-Semitism on the rise among the general public, and yet this great disparity between Jews and the general public?
I think it really does come down to awareness, and really not recognizing anti-Semitism as a societal issue. I think many Americans, are thinking that, and they don't even aware that it's going on, and that maybe it doesn't concern them, that it's not part of something that they should, be working toward to combat. And I think if we look specifically, and I know Avi addressed it, but we can look specifically at what happened in May. This was something that consumed the Jewish community, and rightfully so, as Jews were being attacked in the streets in the United States and around the world. I mean, we had at least an 80% increase, this is a documented increase of anti-Semitic incidents in our country in May. I mean, the United Kingdom had a 500% increase. And yet when we asked Americans, have they heard about this? Only 11% of US adults had heard a lot. And then 37% said they had heard something. So again, we saw that graph. It's about half of American Jews' awareness. And I think it kind of came to a head even for us working in the survey data when we were working with our company, SSRS, it's an independent research firm. These are well-educated, news-watching Americans. And they weren't aware, they didn't see it on the news. One of the researchers on our project just did not know that Jews were being attacked in May. And I really think it comes down to how do we engage our media outlets on what is being reported, how it's being reported. And I honestly don't think that the media is one, accurately covering anti-Semitism, nor do I think they recognize how important it is not to minimize it, not to diminish it, to actually treat it as seriously as other forms of racism and bigotry. We asked that question of American Jews: to what extent do you think anti-Semitism is treated less seriously than other forms of bigotry? And 46% of American Jews said it's treated less seriously. It's not treated as seriously or the same as other forms of bigotry. And so I think in our advocacy, when we engage with media outlets, we need to charge these outlets. It's their duty and responsibility to educate the public on what's happening in the world, and to do it accurately and objectively. And so that's really our charge going forward.
Thank you. I think we talked earlier about the reporting and the importance of reporting, but one of the statistics that I think is so striking is that 39% of American Jews have said they changed their behavior over the past 12 months out of fear of anti-Semitism. So what's striking about this is that it's not something that would be captured by reporting. You can't report to the FBI or to the police that you, for example, I have a friend in Chicago who told me this weekend they chose not to hang a mezuzah outside their home in Chicago and only have them inside out of fear of being targeted. So you mentioned in the slides a little bit about other ways in which this fear manifests, but what else do we know about this, the changing in behavior And what is it that we should be thinking about as we understand this important data point?
So for those of you who may be unfamiliar with the origins of our survey, we really borrowed a lot of these questions from a survey that was done in Europe. The Fundamental Rights Agency conducted a survey on European Jews and how they were experiencing anti-Semitism several years ago at a time when Jews were being killed actually in Western Europe. And one of these questions, a lot of the questions that we asked about behavior changes, hiding your identity, hiding a Jewish star or a kippah, or not going to a Jewish institution out of fear of anti-Semitism, was asked of our European counterparts. And those numbers were much higher. And I think we thought when we asked those questions here in the United States, they would be much lower. And when we look at the numbers, and again, just to be accurate, it is the majority of behavior changes, which we asked about. We asked about behavior changes in not posting things online, behavior changes in removing your Jewish identity, not wearing a kippah, or et cetera, or not going to a Jewish institution in the last year out of fear of anti-Semitism. Those numbers were actually pretty low. The biggest one was not posting something online, 25%, and then right around 1 in 5 for the other two. So when we say 4 in 10, and this is important because I had some questions about this. When we say 39%, 4 in 10, it just means that 4 in 10 chose at least one of those things that they've not done in the past year. This is important for us to recognize that identities are being changed, but I also think we can't still sell it as the American Jewish community is fearful or afraid, or we're not resilient, et cetera. Because I think when that happens, and when we report on that, and that's kind of what we lead with sometimes, the anti-Semites win. And I want to make sure that when we share this information, this is just the honest truth of what the Jewish community is feeling. But still, there's much more than just the fear there. There's actually some good news in the survey as well.
All right, thank you. I'd like to ask both of you, and Avi, if you want to start, and then Holly, I'd like you to answer the same question. As we think about Jewish advocacy going forward and what it is we need to be doing, how does this survey and this report help us? And Avi, if you can help us think about some of the advocacy we do on Capitol Hill and the United Nations, our diplomatic work. And Holly, you've done so much important work engaging with social media and with tech platforms and with the corporate world. If you can both address that, and Avi, we'll start with you.
Sure. So first of all, I think, again, this data illustrates the gravity of the problem. This is an issue that is not going away. If we had thought perhaps a few years ago that anti-Semitism was mostly a problem that was relegated to certain other parts of the world, we know that it has come home, and has come home, at least it seems for now, for good. And so we have to figure out how we can work with our elected officials, with our law enforcement agencies, to share this data and use it to make the point that we need to make about protecting Jews and protecting Jewish life in America. So for example, as we had mentioned earlier, the fact that there is no mandate that law enforcement agencies are not required to report hate crimes to the FBI, and therefore the FBI hate crime statistics that come out are extremely incomplete, I think is tremendously problematic. We need to demand that law enforcement agencies across the country collect and report hate crimes data year after year, so that we have a more complete picture of the problem in the United States. We should be talking about the IRA definition, the definition that was composed by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance to define and figure out the scope of anti-Semitism, what is or is not considered anti-Semitic. That is something that has been adopted by countries around the world, by major organizations. This is something that we should be encouraging the use of throughout the country for a variety of different purposes. Law enforcement agencies can find this tool extremely useful in determining what is or is not anti-Semitic, what is considered to be a form of Jew hatred by Jews themselves. And it includes many of the things we talked about today: tropes against Jews, tropes against Israel or against Zionists. All that is included in the IRA definition, and that is certainly something that we should be pushing with the greatest possible intent. And I think finally, we just have to ensure that the focus, that the attention of the country is on this issue. And not because when you attack Jews, then someday other people will be attacked as well. When you attack Jews, that's bad in and of itself. it's not just the canary in the coal mine. It's not just that things that happen to Jews eventually happen to others as well. That may be a compelling, I think, interest-based way of looking at it. But at the end of the day, Jews are citizens of the United States, and they deserve protection and to live freely and comfortably just as any other person does. And so that, I think, should be foremost in our minds and in the minds of our elected officials when we engage in these conversations. And that, I believe, is what this data enables us to do.
Melanie, I'll just add to Avi's explanation about the tech companies and private businesses and how we're engaging in the corporate world with this data. I think with our engagement with tech companies, we found that 1 in 8 American Jews have been targeted by anti-Semitism online. This is not a reflection on what they even see and what's out there. It's that they themselves have been personally targeted. That's 12% of American Jews. And we found that 1 in 5 actually felt that experienced anti-Semitism felt physically threatened. We had never asked this question before, and we found that 1 in 5 American Jews who were targeted online felt physically threatened. So within social media, we really need to demand increased moderation. Again, we know that reported content is not coming down, but also transparency. And this is really important because, and I think we've all been, if we're just paying attention to the news, we're seeing Facebook, we're seeing other companies under a lot of criticism right now. They know that their algorithms are promoting hateful content, something that we've known within the Jewish community with regards to anti-Semitism for many years. And we have to ensure in our advocacy that these algorithms, don't promote anti-Semitic content. They did, by the way, in May. We can look back and we have this proof now, but unfortunately between the conflict between Israel and Hamas, we saw anti-Semitic memes and videos popularized algorithmically on Instagram, on TikTok. It was the algorithm promoting these images and these memes, and it's a numbers game. We just look at the sheer numbers of even Jews in the world. And this led users all over the world to seeing and sharing, often unknowingly, anti-Semitic conspiracies and misinformation. So a fix for this is going to require reimagining how content is shared on social media. It can't be as easy as it is now. And this is something that AJC is actively engaging in with all the major tech platforms. And then I'll just quickly go to private businesses. And this is related to actually the company culture, at Google, at Facebook, at Twitter as well. This is a similar conversation, but especially after May, we had a lot of concerns amongst Jewish employees that they were feeling isolated or made to defend Israel or disavow Israel or just put in a position that no other employee would face. And it was really this double standard. And I think something that we're working on now is looking to private businesses and ensuring that their company's DEI framework one includes Jews, but also recognizes Jewish diversity. I think that's a big challenge in our country right now when so many people see things as black and white, oppressor versus oppressed. But we have to be the advocates to say that Jews are not only white, they're black Jews from Ethiopia, brown Jews from India, Sephardic Mizrahi Jews from North Africa and Turkey, Persian Jews whose history goes back to the time of the Zoroastrians, or so amongst others. And companies, they're not aware of this. They should be aware of this and really seeing anti-Semitism as more than a religious bias. We know that Jews aren't targeted at this point anymore. Sometimes they are, but a lot of times they're not just targeted for their religion. It's much more than that. And this gets into the conspiratorial nature of anti-Semitism, that superior piece of Jews being assailed for having too much power or control. And that's not something that's talked about within the company setting. And we need to be able to provide those resources on how to better understand anti-Semitism for companies.
Thank you. And my final question to both of you, and Holly, I hope you'll make a plug for AJC's Translate Hate resource as well, is what can our audience today do about these findings? We have a really wonderful, wonderful audience watching and listening, and I'm sure they're all interested to know, okay, we take that, what do we do with this? So Avi, if you can speak to what the Jewish community can do, but first, Holly, what can our allies do? And what are some of the other resources AJC has available?
I'll start with the allies. One, because I got excited about Translate Hate, but also because I got excited that we actually have a program this evening with our AJC San Francisco office. It's an advocacy anywhere program on anti-Semitism and DEI in the corporate world. And I think that's another example of where we're doing these educational programs to reach reach corporations and try to share our resources, such as Translate Hate. So Translate Hate is a compendium of more than 40 terms and themes that can become anti-Semitic and how they become anti-Semitic. It's all very visual to really help non-Jews, but I've been told it's helps Jews as well understand what anti-Semitism is, how to explain it, and how to recognize it. And so that's actually leads right into the very first thing that we ask for our non-Jewish allies is recognizing anti-Semitism. Defining it, again, using the IRA working definition, using Translate Hate, and sharing that information with other non-Jewish allies, families, and friends. And then I think once they recognize it, they can respond by really taking action and raising awareness. We know again that Americans are seeing anti-Semitism. If those 4 in 10 Americans that saw anti-Semitism in the last 12 months actually reported it and didn't just leave it to the Jewish community to report it, I think we'd have a lot more success in pushing back against the problem. And then the third thing I'll say with the responding for our non-Jewish allies is really being in coalition with the Jewish community, supporting legislation that better protects the Jewish community, helps the reporting and prosecution of hate crimes, and also joining in educational initiatives in their cities. We know that there's 1 in 3 Americans don't know Jews. So how can we bring knowledge about Jews and Judaism and Jewish life into these areas? Something as simple as making sure your city doesn't have a big meeting or a big election meeting or on Yom Kippur. Something as simple as just recognizing that these are Jewish holidays, showing respect for and understanding for Jewish American identity and practice, I think is the first and most important step.
So I would co-sign everything that Holly said, as I tend to do, but I would add a few more. First and foremost, for those of us who are watching this who are themselves Jewish, share this data. Share it with your friends, your colleagues, put it on your social networks. You can access it at ajc.org/anti-Semitism report. I encourage you to delve into it and then share it widely. We know that this is a problem that is being felt by many Jews across the country, but there are others who may not be as acutely aware of it or may not be aware of the extent to which we feel it's gotten worse over time. So please do share it. Secondly, share your own stories. If you have encountered anti-Semitism, if you've changed your own behavior in response to fear or concern about anti-Semitism or your comfort as a Jew, share that as well. You can do that sharing using the hashtag anti-Semitism report. This is something that we're encouraging people to do on Twitter and on Instagram, but you can just do it in your conversations with friends. If you feel that this is something that has affected your life, others should know about it because this is a problem that cannot be ignored and should not be ignored by our non-Jewish neighbors. And the third thing I would say is when you're having conversations with elected officials, on a local level or a state level or a federal level, if you're having conversations with your members of Congress, bring this up. Say this is a problem that is on your mind and you need to see addressed. If you're having conversations on a local level, ask about the reporting of hate crimes. Does your city, does your town, your county report hate crimes to the FBI? And if not, insist that they do. This is something that we can all do, and this is something an effort in which we can all partake, because ultimately it will take Jews and non-Jews, Americans of all backgrounds, to combat and hopefully end this problem once and for all.
Avi and Holly, thank you so much. And Daniel, I will now turn it back to you. I know we have way more questions than we can answer today, but I'll let you have the hard task of sifting through them.
Thank you, Melanie, and thank you, Avi and Holly. Yes, with limited time and tons of questions, maybe we'll do a little bit of a lightning round. So I'll ask each of you several questions. Avi, we'll start with you from Gary Berman. Are we really experiencing a rise in anti-Semitism, or is it a heightened sensitivity to it, or a more sophisticated measurement system, or are people just more willing to let it out in the open, or is it all of the above?
Well, it certainly might be all of the above. As we know, American Jews overwhelmingly do feel that anti-Semitism is getting worse. We see this one year after the other, that there's a sense that anti-Semitism is worse today than it was 5 years ago. We know, of course, as Holly has pointed out, that Jews are grossly overrepresented in both hate crimes generally and specifically hate crimes that target individuals on the basis of their religion. And we see what's happening in the streets. We see even those things that do ultimately make it to the media, including the events of this past summer. There is indeed a sense that anti-Semitism is not only getting worse, but it's coming from multiple sources. And I think that's something that is important to realize and something that we've tried to emphasize in all of our conversations about anti-Semitism, both in the United States and around the world. This is not a simple problem. It is a complicated problem because anti-Semitism comes not just from the right, not just from the left, not just from various other sources. It comes from all of them. And that's how it needs to be addressed. And so I think that in many cases, and this one in particular, the perception does indeed reflect the reality, and this is something that we need to be making sure is part of the conversation on this issue.
Holly, from Deborah Bram in Potomac, Maryland, if over half of Americans aren't aware of anti-Semitic attacks happening against Jews, like what we saw happen in May, what can we do to raise awareness among our non-Jewish friends and allies?
So it's going to start locally, I think, and this is the big finding, is that how can they really combat anti-Semitism when so many Americans aren't even aware that it was an issue? So a lot of the work that we're promoting is, working with your non-Jewish friends, and allies, telling them, what this is, like what happened, asking them to speak out. We noticed that we actually had some successes when the Jewish community just asked, and it took some time. In fact, we were hoping that on their own, these communities, our allies, would come and put out statements condemning anti-Semitism. And there was this silence for that week in May, and we actually, AJC launched a campaign called "Where's the Outrage?" because we didn't feel supported. But for so many people that we did reach out to, they said, we didn't know. Oh, we will put a statement. And it wasn't that easy. There, of course, were complications, but we had a lot of people write back and say, yes, we condemn this. Thank you for telling us. Otherwise they wouldn't have been aware. So it really is, it's sharing the information. It's actually asking people to say something, to speak out, and to speak up for the Jewish community.
Thank you, Avi. From Val Siegler in Philadelphia, for the questions about changing Jewish behavior, is there a big difference between religious Jews and secular Jews?
We did see some variation on this, and I think it's perhaps unsurprising that those who are more inclined to wear Jewish items on a regular basis, for example, a kippah, which is something that many Orthodox Jews will wear every single day, many of them reported engaging in these behaviors more than those, for example, who are less inclined to do so. But I think it's important to note that across all of these demographics and across all of these differences of denomination, there was a keen sense that anti-Semitism is not only a problem, but one that is causing people to change their behaviors. We also saw this, by the way, with regard to young people. Young people were actually more likely to be engaging in changed behaviors as a result of concerns of anti-Semitism. And so this is something that I think we need to be aware of. And when we talk about this problem, focus in on the fact that this is something that's actually affecting people's lives. It's not just something that's out there or something they're somewhat aware of and perhaps are disturbed by in an abstract sense. People are literally changing their lives, limiting their behavior, and confronting their identity in a much more constrained way as a result of their fears of anti-Semitism.
Thank you. Holly, from Herman Krukowski in Denver, Colorado, why would the numbers for physical anti-Semitic incidents be higher on the AJC survey than, for example, what might be reported to police, Southern Poverty Law Center, or other tracking agencies?
It's a really good question, because we know that we really can't extrapolate that 3% and say like thousands and thousands and thousands of Jews are having these physical attacks. But we only know what we know. And again, I go back to that. So 37 American Jews said that they had been physically attacked in the last 12 months. That number is actually less than 1% in the Northeast, in the West, in the Midwest, and it's at 6% in the South. And that's actually really fascinating to find that 25 American Jews who live in the South is where the physical attacks happen. And again, we didn't define, it was self-defined what physical attacks were. We just asked if you were attacked physically because of anti-Semitism. So again, it comes down to, we don't know what the attack was and why they did or did not go to the police. We know that half of them, again, these are such small numbers, so we can't extrapolate at all, but we know that, of the 37, I think 18 went to the police, and then the other half didn't. But I think that speaks to a bigger issue here, is that many American Jews actually aren't reporting, in part because they don't think anything's going to be done about it. We do know that law enforcement agencies across the country actually don't even report that data to the FBI. So I think that speaks to a little bit, unfortunately, of the resignation that some in the community are feeling toward fighting anti-Semitism, because they don't know if anything's really going to change or anything's going to be done about it.
Thank you. A question from David Rosen's asking, Avi, have you compared the US data with similar data from other Western countries?
Well, as Holly mentioned earlier, the very concept of the survey is based on similar surveys done by the Fundamental Rights Agency of the European Union. And so we actually do have some comparable data. We have in fact, done some of those comparisons on a very ad hoc basis. We know that the situational differences are significant, and we don't want to try and compare one societal context with another. But yes, we have in fact done some of that work. You know that our colleagues at AJC Europe and elsewhere have also surveyed Jews in their locations in order to ask about very similar questions about their experiences and perceptions of anti-Semitism. And I have to say that while in the past, perhaps 5 or 10 years ago, I would have thought that the differences would be vast and we would never see the sort of concern about anti-Semitism or changed behaviors as a result of anti-Semitism in the United States as we see in Europe, what we see is a narrowing of those gaps. And that in fact, American Jews are increasingly taking many of the steps that European Jews have been taking for a very long time in response to anti-Semitism. For example, hiding their identity, limiting their behaviors, going in certain places as opposed to others, and so on and so forth. So yes, indeed, we do see that there are certain similarities between the two. And this, of course, is something that we will continue to study for a very long time.
More questions. This is to you, Holly, from Janice Ellen in Atlanta. Regarding the question, were you targeted on social media, which you explained in your presentation, how was targeting described or were examples given?
That was the exact word we used. Have you been targeted, by an anti-Semitism, online post or remark online or on social media? And it's an interesting question, actually, because I think that's different. It's different to be targeted yourself or to experience it as like a third party as seeing it. And we use that word targeted because it was actually the same question that we had asked the past 2 years. So one of the things that we tried to do, even though we've changed the time frame on some of our questions, is trying to keep the questions as similar to how we've asked them in 2020, how we've asked them in 2019, so we can kind of see those differences. And so the question we've asked previously is, have you been targeted, you yourself, by anti-Semitism online or on social media? I actually think for the next time we do this survey, I want to have a better sense of American Jews just seeing anti-Semitism, witnessing it on platforms, not just to them personally. That's important, and we still need to ask that question, but just getting a better sense of how much of this do you see, and where is it? And because that's also going to help our advocacy going forward.
Thank you. We have time for one final question, and Holly, maybe we'll start with you. It's kind of turning it around a little bit, but is there anything in this survey data that actually gives you a sense of hope?
This is my favorite question. It's grim data. It really is. It's not good when you look at the numbers, when you see what American Jews are experiencing and what they're feeling. But this is my second year really in the data, and there's a few factors that give me hope. One is the awareness. I mentioned it, the awareness of the term anti-Semitism. That gives me hope. Another thing that gives me hope is just realizing how many Americans don't know Jews. I mean, it makes sense when you think about the numbers, but just how many don't know Jews, and yet there's still work to be done, but they still recognize anti-Semitism as a problem. So that was encouraging. Another encouraging finding was that Jews feel more secure this year. So even though they still experience anti-Semitism, we saw that chart that showed the rise in security this year compared to last year. That's room for hope as well. And then I think the final room for hope is, again, the numbers of Americans that recognize Israel's right to exist and denying that as a form of anti-Semitism. That number was 74% last year of Americans, and we were excited about 3/4 of the general public think the statement's anti-Semitic. That number jumped to 85%, a 10% jump just in the last year alone, recognizing that denial of Israel's right to exist, of Jewish people's right to self-determination is anti-Semitic. That's also a reason to hope.
And if I might add just one more point to what Holly just said so beautifully, when we talk about those who know Jews versus those who don't, the more someone knows a Jewish person, the more likely he or she is to be sensitized to anti-Semitism, to be aware of the problem, to view anti-Semitism in ways that are similar to how Jews view the problem. And so I think there's actually a lot of hope there, because we know that the more we familiarize the broader American public with Jews, with Jewish life, with Judaism, with different ways and different forms of Jewish practice and different ways that Jews look and the diversity of Jewish life, the more we will see this sensitivity, this awareness of anti-Semitism increase. And hopefully we can then hope that will cause anti-Semitism itself to gradually recede into the distance. And so I think that is something that is now on our shoulders as a community and as an organization, and hopefully everyone watching today, work on familiarizing your neighbors with Jews, with Jewish practice, with Jewish life. This is something that we should obviously do as a society as well, because ultimately that will be a key part of bringing this terrible problem finally to an end.
Avi and Holly, I want to thank both of you so much for walking us through all of this data. To our viewers and listeners, I just want to remind you that you can find all of this and more on our website at ajc.org. We encourage you to read through it yourself, dive in deeper. We know there were so many questions. Obviously, there are limitations in a survey like this. We can't ask 300 questions of everyone we survey. And so there are many questions that it's clear you would like to see us ask that we simply couldn't in this particular survey. But we're grateful to all of you for listening, and we wish all of you a wonderful afternoon. Thank you so much.